They told me straight to my face, "You fix pipes, that's it, nothing more." The words landed harder than any slap, sharper than any insult I had ever carried home on my shoulders. It wasn't said in anger, it was worse. It was said with amusement, with a chuckle that spread across the break room like fire on dry wood, feeding on itself until the sound of their laughter drowned everything else. I had only been trying to offer an idea, a plan, drawn from years of crawling through basements, memorizing the rhythm of valves and the fragile pulse of pipes that ran beneath the university like veins through a body. I had spent nights sketching diagrams no one asked for, tinkering with calculations while the world slept, convinced that one day someone might see the worth in them. That morning, I finally brought my voice into the light. But the moment I opened my mouth, their eyes rolled, and before I finished the first sentence, the smirks appeared. Then came the words, "You fix pipes, that's it." The phrase was spat with such finality it might as well have been a verdict. I was sentenced to invisibility, confined to the world of wrenches and rust, forbidden to dream beyond the basement. The laughter that followed was not light. It was cruel. It came from men who had once leaned on me when the heat failed at midnight, from supervisors whose offices would have frozen in winter if not for the calloused hands they now mocked. Even the younger ones, who barely knew the sound of a boiler hissing under strain, joined in, eager to laugh with the powerful rather than risk standing with the forgotten. Their laughter made me small, made me a joke in the very place I had kept alive for decades. The sting cut deeper because I had walked into that room carrying pride. I thought perhaps they would listen, that they might see me as more than the man who disappeared into shadows when the ceiling leaked or the pipes burst. I thought they might recognize that my work was not just sweat and grit. It was knowledge. It was skill. It was foresight. Instead, my pride crumbled into dust with every chuckle, every dismissive glance, every folded arm that told me I had overstepped my place. I stood there, hands tightening around the paper I held, the diagrams trembling slightly as if they too had absorbed the humiliation. My words withered in my throat. I wanted to argue, to tell them that I knew more about the bones of this campus than any of them ever would, that my fingerprints ran through every hallway in the form of warmth, running water, safety. But the laughter was too loud, too sharp, too final. So I fell silent. And in that silence, something heavy pressed itself into my chest. Not just humiliation, but betrayal. Because it wasn't strangers who mocked me. It was the very people who depended on me, who lived in buildings held together by the unseen labor of my hands. Their laughter told me my years meant nothing, that my sacrifices had vanished into steam and rust, that I was only ever going to be the man who fixed pipes. I walked out of that room quieter than I had entered, but inside me a fire flickered. They thought their laughter had buried me, but it had only planted something deeper. Because truth doesn't vanish under ridicule. It waits. And one day, the same voices that laughed would be forced to hear me, whether they wanted to or not. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This way, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to light. And now, we continue. The break room laughter faded into memory, but the humiliation did not end there. It followed me through hallways, echoed in meetings, clung to every corner of the campus I had worked so hard to keep alive. From that day on, I was no longer just the man who fixed pipes. I was invisible. Decisions were made above me, around me, without me. I was never invited into the rooms where choices shaped the future of the university, though the walls of those rooms themselves relied on the systems I had built and maintained with my hands. At staff meetings, I sat at the far end of the table, papers folded neatly before me, notes prepared, diagrams ready, only to watch them skip me, ignore me, move straight to the voices they believed mattered. They spoke of budgets, of renovations, of expansions. tossing around numbers and plans as if the bones of the buildings were abstract, as if water and heat would flow by magic. I wanted to tell them that pipes are not abstract, that a single overlooked valve could undo their grandest project, but my voice was not called upon. My silence was assumed. It is a strange kind of pain to sit in a room and feel the weight of your knowledge pressing against your chest, while those around you treat you as though you are not there. They talked about infrastructure, but never to the man who kept it breathing. They praised architects for their drawings and applauded contractors for their schedules, while the one who knew where every joint creaked, where every pipe threatened to burst, was left out of the conversation. It was not only disrespect, it was erasure. The worst of it was not the strangers, nor the administrators who saw me only as another line on a budget sheet. The worst of it was the people I had helped for years. Professors whose classrooms I had kept warm in the dead of winter passed me in corridors with distracted nods, never meeting my eyes. Students who once thanked me for restoring their showers after a burst pipe hurried past, their heads bent into books, forgetting the man who had waded waist-deep in freezing water so their mornings would begin in comfort. Even my son, studying now at the same university, avoided walking beside me when I carried my tools. His silence was the loudest of them all. Every corridor became heavier. Every closed door reminded me that while the campus stood solid above ground, I carried its fragile lifeblood below, unacknowledged, unseen. They could decorate walls with banners, open new lecture halls with applause, celebrate achievements with speeches, but none of it would stand a single day without the silent systems that hummed under their feet. Systems I had given my life to. Systems no one cared to remember until they failed. Disrespect is not always shouted. Sometimes it is lived in the way eyes slide past you, the way conversations skip your name, the way your presence does not register in the room. It is a slow, grinding humiliation, heavier even than ridicule, because it does not attack you directly, it erases you instead. That was the weight I carried every day, to walk through buildings that lived because of me, and yet feel as though I had no place in them. And so, I learned to hold my silence like armor. I stopped raising my hand in meetings, stopped offering my ideas. I wrote my notes anyway, sketched improvements on scraps of paper, tucked them away in folders no one asked to see. They thought they had silenced me. They thought they had buried me in irrelevance. But deep down, I knew the truth. A building without its pipes is only a shell. And one day, when their arrogance cracked, they would remember the man who had carried the weight they chose to forget. The sharpest wounds are not dealt by strangers, but by the hands of those you once carried. Betrayal is never louder than when it arrives in silence, in turned faces, in the quiet refusal to acknowledge who you are and what you've done. That was the cruelty I lived with day after day, watching the very people I had helped through countless nights avert their eyes, as if they had never known me. There were nights when alarms blared through the campus, when water hammered against metal and threatened to drown basements, when the heating system sputtered in the dead of winter. I had been there, crawling through the dark, wrench biting into my palms, sleeves soaked to the skin. I had patched lines at dawn so students could sit in warm classrooms, repaired valves so professors could deliver their lectures without seeing their breath fog in the air. I had worked through weekends, through holidays, through nights so long they blurred into mornings. Not because anyone asked, but because the building breathed through me, and if I turned away, it would collapse. And yet, the same people whose comfort I preserved pretended not to see me. The janitor I once helped at midnight, when the pipes burst in his wing, now kept his distance, as if gratitude had an expiration date. Professors who had shaken my hand after I saved their labs from a flood now looked past me in the hallways, their eyes fixed on the ceiling, the floor, anywhere but on mine. It was as if my presence embarrassed them, reminded them that beneath their polished halls and perfect lectures, everything stood on the work of men they chose to forget. But nothing cut deeper than the silence of my son. He was proud to be a student at the university, proud of the lectures he attended, the professors he admired, the peers he called his equals. But of me, he was not proud. When he walked with friends across campus and saw me hauling my toolbox, his face would harden, his steps quicken. He would nod stiffly, or sometimes not at all, as though I were a stranger whose path had simply crossed his. He spoke of wanting a real career, one that wouldn't leave his hands stained with rust or his clothes smelling of oil. To him, my work was dirt. It was shame. It was something to rise above, not something to honor. I had given my life to keeping this place alive, and yet my own son could not see me without looking away. That was betrayal in its purest form. Not hatred, not cruelty, but shame, his shame in me. And I carried it like a weight no one else could feel. A stone pressed into my chest that grew heavier each time he passed without a word. At night, when I returned home with my clothes damp and my hands scarred, I sometimes thought of confronting him, of telling him what it meant to be invisible, what it cost to give everything and receive nothing in return. But each time, the words died before they reached my lips. He would not have understood. Not yet. The betrayal of colleagues, of professors, of staff. It hurt, but it was survivable. I could tell myself they were selfish, blind, lost in their own importance. But my son, his silence pierced deeper than laughter ever could. It told me that my worth had vanished, not only in the halls of the university, but in the heart of my own blood. And still I endured, because betrayal cannot undo the truth. The pipes still ran because of me. The heat still flowed. The lights still shone. My son could deny me. The university could erase me. But their survival remained in my hands. That was my bitter comfort. That was the truth I carried in silence. The break room laughter, the lowered eyes of those I once helped, the shame on my own son's face, all of it followed me into the one place where I still felt whole, the boiler room. It was not beautiful. It was not the kind of space anyone would hang portraits of or mention in speeches. But to me, it was a cathedral. The smell of scorched metal and oil, the hiss of steam escaping through unseen cracks, the heavy breathing of the old furnace. It was a chorus I knew by heart. Each pipe was a vein, each valve a heartbeat, and in those sounds I could still hear dignity, even if the world above refused to see it. The walls bore the marks of my years. Rust I had sanded away, joints I had replaced, valves I had polished until they turned stubbornly once again. My hands had been burned here, scarred by scalding steam when pressure gauges failed. The skin on my palms had hardened against the bite of wrenches, against the trembling of bolts that refused to turn until I poured all my weight into them. In those long nights underground, while the campus slept, I gave pieces of myself to the machines, skin, blood, hours of life I would never reclaim, and yet no one ever came to see. I remembered the winters most of all, nights when the pipes moaned under frost, when the thermometer outside dropped so low the air felt like shards of glass. The students in their dormitories slept in warmth because I was down here, crouched with a blowtorch over frozen lines, listening for the faint sound of cracking that meant disaster was near. There were nights when I worked until dawn, when the sweat from my brow froze on my collar, when the hiss of steam filled my ears until I could not hear my own heartbeat. No professor knew. No administrator asked. The students awoke to hot showers and never questioned why. And then there were the floods. When ancient joints burst and water surged through basements, I was the one wading waist deep, flashlight clenched between my teeth, twisting valves that hadn't moved in decades. I had seen rooms drown in minutes, archives, storage, classrooms, and saved them not with speeches or applause, but with sheer endurance, my body aching in the dark. No one thanked me in the daylight. They saw only dry floors and assumed luck. They never knew whose hands had wrestled luck into submission. In the quiet hours, when no emergency called me, I spread papers on the workbench, my own sketches, diagrams of improvements no one requested, systems reimagined, solutions to problems no one else even noticed. My handwriting filled page after page, pencil marks, smudged edges, ink stained with sweat. I traced new pipe routes that would save pressure, designed bypass valves that could prevent bursts, dreamed of a system that would not merely survive, but endure for decades. I drew with hope, with faith that someday someone would ask, "Is there a better way?" But the questions never came. Those drawings piled up in folders and drawers, hidden like secrets. They were my silent rebellion against the laughter. My proof that I was not just a man with tools and grease on his hands. I was an engineer in my heart, an architect of the unseen, a builder of the invisible veins that made the campus live. The world above would never honor those sketches. They would remain folded in shadows, like me. And yet, when I looked at them, I felt alive again. Because I knew their value, even if no one else did. I knew that every night I spent here, hunched over pipes and paper, was not wasted. They could laugh, they could forget, they could betray, but they could not take from me the memory of the boiler room. This place held my truth. The hum of the furnace, the pulse of the pipes, the smell of steam and iron. This was where my dignity lived, even if no one else cared to see it. And one day, I believed, the world above would be forced to reckon with the things that began down here in the dark. After a time, I stopped trying to explain myself. Words had become brittle things, snapping uselessly against the stone wall of their arrogance. Every attempt to defend my work, every quiet offering of an idea, every careful suggestion about safety or improvement was met with rolled eyes, smirks, or dismissive waves of the hand. Their contempt had carved something deep in me, and at last I understood. Arguing with those who had already chosen to be blind was like shouting into an empty tunnel. The echoes might return, but no one would listen. So I laid down my words. I let my silence become the only answer I gave them. It was not the silence of surrender. It was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of weight, of patience, of a truth that no laughter could erase and no arrogance could rewrite. I carried that silence like armor. Each time someone mocked, each time someone ignored me in a meeting, each time I watched my son turn his face away when his friends were near, I said nothing. But inside, that silence was gathering strength. There is a kind of silence that feels empty, hollow, like a wound that refuses to heal. And then there is another kind, the silence that waits, that hardens, that grows heavy with the certainty that sooner or later the truth will break through. Mine was the second kind. I let them think they had stolen my voice, that I had been reduced to nothing more than the man who fixed pipes. Let them laugh. Let them erase. I knew better. In the boiler room, alone with the hum of metal and the hiss of steam, I trained myself in this silence. I did not talk back when administrators brushed past me. I did not complain when professors claimed credit for keeping the labs warm, as though heat appeared by magic. I did not explain myself when my son told me again that he wanted a real life, not one in the dirt like yours. My throat burned with swallowed words, but I did not release them. Because I knew the truth. Explanations given to the deaf only waste the strength of the speaker, and I would not waste mine. My silence became heavier than their words. When I walked into a room, I no longer felt the need to defend myself. I let their glances slide past me. I let their arrogance fill the air, and I carried my truth alone, pressed against my chest like a stone that grew denser with every day. They thought I was defeated. They thought they had taken something from me. But the truth was that in my silence I became untouchable. For silence, when tied to truth, is not absence. It is preparation. It waits until arrogance has spent itself, until the lies crumble under their own emptiness, until the moment comes when no one can deny what was hidden. I felt that moment approaching, though I could not yet see how or when. It lived in the rhythm of the pipes I repaired, in the sketches I folded into drawers, in the quiet certainty that someday all the things they mocked me for would be the very things that saved them. So I stayed silent. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I was waiting for the day when my silence would turn into something they could no longer ignore. The meetings always began the same way. Polished shoes tapping against polished floors, voices brimming with self-importance, papers shuffled like weapons in a duel. They spoke of grants, of endowments, of projects that would bring prestige to the university and recognition to their names. They argued over who would sit on which committee, whose proposal would win more funding, whose idea would attract the wealthiest donors. They spoke as though the heart of the university beat only in headlines and gala speeches. I sat at the edge of those meetings when I was invited at all, a ghost in the room, listening as they dismissed the things that truly held their empire together. They called the infrastructure black work, invisible labor not fit for attention. They laughed when budgets included repairs to heating systems or replacements of old pipes, waving their hands as though such things were an annoyance, an afterthought. They loved glass facades and new lecture halls, but they forgot that without the hidden veins beneath them, their monuments would freeze, flood, and crumble. More than once I tried to speak, quietly at first, then with urgency. I told them the valves in the north wing were failing. I showed them the pressure readings that crept higher each winter. I placed my diagrams in front of them, plans I had sketched in the silence of the boiler room, showing a safer system, a stronger design. They barely glanced at the pages before sliding them aside. "We'll review this later," they said. Later never came. When I warned of risks, when I told them that the system was fragile, that a single failure could bring down entire labs, ruin equipment worth millions, they smirked. One of them leaned back in his chair, his smile sharp as a knife, and said, "Pipes are your world, not ours. We build futures here. Don't bother us with leaks." The others chuckled, and the conversation turned back to funding and prestige. Their arrogance was blinding. They believed steel beams and new paint would hold their glory forever, forgetting that water and heat do not wait for applause. They dismissed me because my hands were calloused, because my voice did not sound like theirs, because what I spoke of was hidden, unglamorous, dirty. But beneath their arrogance I saw their fear. They wanted to believe the campus was indestructible, that the foundation of their pride was eternal. To admit otherwise would have been to admit they depended on the very man they mocked. I carried my silence again, but inside I felt the pressure building, not just in the pipes, but in myself. I knew what they refused to know. The system would not hold forever. Metal fatigues, joints weaken, valves surrender to time. You can laugh at warnings, but pipes do not laugh back. They burst. As I left those meetings, their voices still echoing with arrogance, I walked the corridors with my head bowed, but my mind alive. I could hear the whispers of the pipes as clearly as if they were speaking. They groaned, they sighed, they called out in tones no administrator would ever recognize, but I heard them, and I knew. The day would come when their laughter would drown in the sound of rushing water and breaking steel, and when it did, My silence would not be weakness. It would be proof that I had always been right. The winter came hard that year, heavier and sharper than the last. Snow buried the campus in silence, but beneath the white drifts I could hear the groaning of the buildings. The pipes spoke to me in whispers that no one else could hear. It began with small tremors, barely perceptible rattles in the walls, tiny shivers in the valves that once held firm. Pressure gauges wavered more often, dropping, then spiking again like a fever that could not be broken. To others, the building stood proud and quiet, a picture of stability under the frost. To me, they were trembling like old bones under too much weight. Each night, I walked the basements with my flashlight, the beam cutting through steam and dust. I ran my hands along the pipes, listening with my fingertips. The metal was cold, too cold, and brittle as if it might splinter at any moment. I tapped a valve and felt it quiver back, the vibration traveling through my palm, through my wrist, into my chest. It was the heartbeat of a dying system, and I was the only one listening. The students above me walked with scarves wrapped high and coffee cups steaming in their hands. They laughed in the courtyards, their boots crunching against the snow, never knowing how close the warmth they depended on was to vanishing. Professors taught in their heated rooms, projectors humming, while I crouched in dark corners listening to the metal sigh. They trusted the silence of comfort. I trusted the language of strain. In meetings, I tried again to warn them. My voice was steady, but my urgency leaked through. "The North Line can't handle another freeze," I said. "The valves in the East Wing are failing." They nodded absently, their eyes fixed on charts of funding, on architectural renderings of the new library wing. They dismissed me with the same phrase, "We'll get to it later." Later had already run out. I returned to the boiler room, my home of shadows, and listened. The sound was different now. The pipes no longer hummed with steady strength. They whined softly, metal scraping against metal, the complaint of old soldiers forced to march when their legs were broken. I knew that sound too well. It was not the warning of something that might happen. It was the whisper of something already happening. Every instinct in me, sharpened by years of labor, told me the same truth. We were standing on borrowed time. The system was at its limit, and the winter was pressing harder with each day. I could feel the moment approaching, a moment when the laughter in the break room, the arrogance in the meetings, the shame in my son's silence, all of it would shatter beneath the roar of bursting steel. I worked alone into the small hours, tightening joints, testing valves, reinforcing weak spots with temporary fixes. My breath hung white in the air, my hands numb and raw, my back bent under the cold weight of inevitability. Every adjustment bought us time, but not safety. I knew I was placing stones against a flood. Above me, the campus slept peacefully in its illusion of permanence. Below, I stood in the half-light of the basement, ears straining to the faintest note of warning. And then, I heard it. A thin, high-pitched ring in the pipes, like a violin string stretched too far, seconds away from snapping. I closed my eyes. I knew that sound. It was not a question anymore. It was a countdown. And so I waited. Not with fear, but with the grim patience of someone who has spent his life listening to what others refuse to hear. The winter had found its weakness. The pipes were speaking. And soon, they would scream. It happened at 3 a.m, the hour when the world is darkest, when silence lies heavy and the smallest sound can tear it apart. I was half asleep in my chair in the boiler room, the hum of the furnace my only company, when the noise hit me, like thunder trapped underground. A violent crack, followed by the roar of rushing water. The floor trembled beneath me, and I knew instantly. The pipes had broken. I grabbed my tools before thought could catch up with me and ran. The hallways above were quiet, every window frosted with winter's breath, every lamp glowing dully against the snow. But below, in the bones of the building, chaos had awakened. As I descended the steps to the laboratory basement, the air changed, wet, cold, alive with the sound of water forcing its way through concrete. When I opened the heavy door, it hit me like a wave. The corridor had become a river, water rushing ankle deep, carrying papers, fragments of cardboard, the broken remains of boxes. The smell of iron and rust mixed with the sharp sting of chemicals leaking from overturned containers. And ahead I could see it. The great pipe in the main line split open like a wound, metal torn, water gushing with unstoppable fury. The roar was deafening. Alarms had not yet gone off, but they would. In minutes, the rising water would reach the archive room where documents older than a century were stored, where research worth millions slept in quiet stacks. Across the hall, electrical systems buzzed, sparks flashing dangerously close to the flood. The building was minutes away from destruction, but there was no one there. No administrators, no professors, no staff, no students. No senator to give me a nod of respect. It was only me, my soaked boots, my shaking hands gripping the wrench, and the storm of water screaming through the split. I waded forward, the freezing flood biting into my legs, soaking through every layer of cloth. The pressure of the current nearly knocked me over, but I braced myself against the wall, inching closer to the broken valve. My flashlight beam cut through the spray, illuminating what I already knew. I couldn't close it with ordinary strength. The handle was warped, the bolts rusted into place years ago, ignored despite my warnings. The water pounded against me, each step heavier than the last. My breath came in clouds of steam, my heart hammering against my ribs. But I forced myself onward, teeth clenched, the wrench raised like a weapon. I jammed it against the joint and pulled with everything in me. The metal screamed back, refusing, vibrating under my grip. My palms tore open against the handle, blood mixing with the freezing water, but I did not let go. Finally, with a shriek like something dying, the valve began to move. Not fast, not enough, but it moved. I leaned in, chest pressed against the wet pipe, wrench digging into flesh, pouring the last of my strength into the turn. Inch by inch, the flood slowed, its fury weakening. I grabbed the emergency clamp I had built myself months ago, the one they had laughed at when I showed it to them, and pressed it against the split. It shuddered under the pressure, then held. The roar dulled to a rush, the rush faded to a hiss, and then silence, broken only by the dripping of water and the ragged sound of my breath. I stood there in the dark, soaked to the bone, chest heaving, every muscle trembling. The floor was still flooded, the air still thick with damp and cold, but the building was saved. The archives, the labs, the equipment, all of it lived because I had been there, because I had not stayed silent when the pipes spoke to me. No one would know yet. They would wake in the morning, find their classrooms dry, their lights humming, their documents untouched, and they would call it luck. They would not see the blood on my hands, the bruises on my arms, the torn skin where steel had bitten me. They would not know that at 3 a.m, when disaster struck, it was a man they had called just a pipe fixer who had stood in the water and held back the flood. I leaned against the wall, too exhausted to move, listening to the drip, drip, drip of water falling from broken joints into the shallow pools around me. My silence had been my armor. But tonight, in the dark belly of the university, my work had become my voice. And though no one above could hear it yet, I knew the truth. The pipes were still speaking, and through them, so was I. The water no longer roared like a beast tearing through the walls, but it still hissed and spat, seeping through cracks, drumming against the metal floors of the basement. My arms ached from forcing the rusted valve into submission, my hands torn and raw, but I knew it wasn't over. The pressure would build again, crawling back through the wounded veins of the system, and if I left it as it was, the flood would return. The old joints were too weak, the patched crack too thin. The entire network groaned like an injured animal, begging for relief. I staggered through the dark, the beam of my flashlight dancing wildly against the wet concrete. Every corner carried the sound of dripping, trickling, gurgling. like the pipes themselves whispering their pain. I knew this language, every note of it, and I answered not with words, but with my hands. I reached the junction where the main line split into the eastern wing. There, half buried in dust and forgotten for years, was the set of bypass ports no one cared to maintain. They laughed when I drew the design for a secondary valve, told me it was a waste of time, unnecessary, over-engineering by a janitor with delusions. But I had built it anyway. Piece by piece, in secret, hammering metal in the boiler room, shaping steel with hands that bled, assembling a mechanism that no one had asked for but that I knew someday would matter. I had hidden it like a guilty secret, locking it away in a cabinet marked scrap. And tonight, in the freezing dark, I carried it in my bag. The clamp shone dull silver under my flashlight, scarred and bent from my crude tools, but solid, stubborn, like me. I pulled it free, my fingers numb and clumsy from cold, and pressed it into place. The pipes rattled as if rejecting the intrusion, shuddering against my grip. I cursed under my breath, tightening bolts with shaking hands, the wrench slipping, my palms screaming from the pressure. But slowly, with every turn, the bypass valve seated itself against the wounded line. The moment it locked, I twisted the handle. For a second, nothing happened. Then the system shivered like a body gasping for air. The hiss deepened, the flood slackened, and at last the water began to redirect itself through the new line. The bypass opened its lungs, and the building began to breathe again. I leaned back against the damp wall, my chest heaving, listening as the pressure evened out. The rattling softened, the pounding flow calmed into a steady pulse. The system was alive again, not perfect, not whole, but alive. My valve, the one they had ridiculed, the one they said was useless, had just saved them all. Above ground, the university slept in peace, unaware that its foundation had nearly drowned. Professors would rise to warm offices, students would drink from faucets, administrators would stride through dry halls. They would never know the taste of the ice-cold water that had nearly swallowed their books, their machines, their pride. They would never know how close they had come to losing everything. But I knew, my body knew, aching and soaked, hands swollen and bleeding. My silence knew, heavy but no longer bitter. For in this freezing dark my silence had spoken, not with words, but with a valve that hissed quietly in the shadows, proof of a truth that could no longer be denied. I was not just fixing pipes. I had built life into the veins of this campus with nothing but my stubborn hands. And though no one had seen me, though the halls above still believed I was invisible, I felt something steady rise inside me. Justice had not come yet, but it had begun. In the darkest hour of winter, in the water-soaked basement where no applause would ever reach, the university's heart kept beating, because of me. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the snowy rooftops, the flood had been beaten back. The pipes still hummed with strain, the air still carried the sting of rust and cold, but the worst had passed. The bypass valve hissed softly, holding steady, and the building exhaled like a patient pulled back from the edge. I stood ankle-deep in water gone still, breath heavy, clothes frozen against my skin. My gloves dripped as I peeled them off, fingers raw and trembling. There was no applause in that basement, no eyes to witness what had happened, only silence, broken by the steady drip of water into shallow pools. Above me, life moved on untouched. Students rose in their dormitories, wrapped in warm blankets, unaware of the disaster that had waited outside their doors. They showered in hot water, brewed coffee in kitchens that would have been flooded hours earlier, and laughed with the relief of a morning untouched by crisis. Professors unlocked their classrooms, chalk in hand, their projectors humming as though nothing had threatened their machines in the night. The campus breathed without ever realizing how close it had come to drowning. By midday, whispers moved through the university, an article in the local paper, a note in the morning bulletin. A minor fault contained overnight. Fortunate timing saved the laboratories. They called it luck. They marveled at chance. Not a word was spoken about the man who had been waist-deep in freezing water, who had given his hands to the valves, whose silence had bought them safety. I did not wait for their words. I had another call to answer. Another radiator hissing in the dorms. Another leak in the library ceiling. Another small fire to put out before it grew. I hung my soaked jacket to dry, shoved new tools into my bag, and walked the halls like a shadow. No one knew what I had done. No one stopped me to ask why their classrooms were still dry, why their lights still shone. To them, it was simply another morning. To me, it was proof. Proof that even if they refused to see me, the campus itself carried my voice in every warm room and every dry floor. I pulled my cap lower over my brow and stepped outside into the cutting cold. My boots crunched against the snow, leaving a trail no one would follow. Somewhere, a pipe groaned faintly in the wind, and I turned toward it without hesitation. Because my work was never done. And though the world called it luck, I knew the truth. It began, as so many things do, with paperwork. Reports were filed, damage assessed, costs calculated. At first, the language was clinical: a minor incident, system contained, losses avoided. But then the investigation deepened. They traced the chain of events, followed the trail of valves and gauges, examined the strange bypass clamp that had redirected the surge. It was not on any blueprint. It did not exist in the official records. And yet it had saved the university. The Safety Commission gathered in their long, polished room where voices usually hovered over grant proposals and building expansions. This time, the conversation was different. They leaned over damp schematics pulled from the basement, studied the battered valve assembly, and frowned at the notes scribbled in pencil along the pipe. The names scrawled on every page, the hand that had drawn the diagrams and kept them hidden, surfaced at last. My name. When the rector entered, the voices stilled. He was a man who rarely wasted breath on anything outside his circle of prestige. He valued appearances, reputation, the shine of the university crest above all else. But even he could not ignore the evidence laid before him. With a solemn expression, he read the findings aloud, his voice carrying through the room. The system had been saved, not by chance, not by luck, but by the foresight and labor of one man. And then he said it, my name. It was not a grand speech. It was not coated with praise or flowery language. It was a simple acknowledgement, spoken clearly, unavoidably. The man they had called just a pipe fixer was the author of the design that had saved their laboratories, their archives, their prestige. My name, spoken with weight, silenced the room in a way applause never could. The very people who once laughed at me now shifted in their chairs, eyes cast down. They remembered their jokes, their dismissals, their indifference, and now they heard the rector himself confirm what they had refused to see. For years, I had been invisible, a shadow in the boiler room. But in that moment, the shadow stepped into the light, not because I demanded it, but because the truth left them no choice. I was not in the meeting to hear it. I was in the basement still, tightening bolts, wiping rust from my hands. But word travels quickly in halls where silence once ignored me, and when my name reached me, not whispered in mockery, but carried with recognition, I felt something shift. Not triumph, not vengeance, but dignity, returning like a tide that had always belonged to me. I did not stand before them. I did not prepare speeches nor sharpen words into weapons. I kept working, walking the same corridors I always had, answering the same calls when radiators failed or pipes moaned under strain. My silence remained, but now it no longer carried humiliation. It carried weight. The reports traveled upward, not me. Pages filled with sensor data, pressure readings, sketches pulled from the soaked folders in the basement. Each line of evidence spoke with a voice louder than mine ever could. The investigators traced the sequence of failures and saw how the bypass had turned disaster into survival. They mapped the design back to the drafts I had left behind in dusty drawers, to the pencil strokes of a man they had dismissed. Every proof pointed to me, and I did not have to say a word. When the rector's office confirmed the findings, when the committee signed the report, there was no space left for laughter. Those who had jeered fell silent. Those who had once called me just a pipe fixer could not meet my eyes in the halls. Their silence was not the silence of dismissal anymore. It was the silence of shame. I felt it in small ways. A colleague who had once mocked me shifted awkwardly when I entered the room. A professor who had walked past me 100 times without a glance now nodded stiffly, unable to summon words. Even my son, who had hidden his face from me in front of his friends, began to hesitate, his eyes softer, though still clouded with pride he could not swallow. Their silence pressed heavier on them than it ever had on me. Justice had come, but not through arguments, not through demands, not through my voice forcing its way into rooms that had shut me out. It had come through the undeniable truth of work done, of systems saved, of lives carried forward by hands they had mocked. The truth needed no defense. It needed no decoration. It stood on its own, unbreakable. I did not gloat. I did not seek apologies. I kept my head lowered, my steps steady, my tools in hand. But inside I carried a new calm, the knowledge that dignity, once stripped away, can return without shouting, without vengeance, simply by being undeniable. And as I walked back into the boiler room that evening, the hum of the pipes sounded different. They no longer groaned under dismissal. They sang with quiet vindication. The envelope arrived folded with precision, its paper heavier than anything that usually touched my hands. On its face, a red wax seal pressed with the crest of the university. For a moment I only stared at it, hesitant, as though the weight of the seal might burn through the paper and reveal its message before I chose to know it. My fingers trembled slightly when I broke it open. Inside was a letter, written with careful formality. The rector's office invited me to attend the grand reopening of the restored laboratory hall, the very building I had saved in the dark hours of that winter night. It was more than an invitation. It was a request for me to speak. The words blurred for a moment as I read them again and again. They wanted me, the man who had lived in shadows, the one they called just a pipe fixer, to stand before an audience dressed in suits and gowns and say something worth their silence. For a heartbeat, the letter felt absurd, like a cruel trick dressed in gold ink. I almost said no. I almost folded the invitation away, slipped it into a drawer with my sketches, and let the moment pass. I had lived too long in silence. To step into their light felt like stepping into a world where I did not belong. What could I say to them that the roar of bursting pipes had not already screamed? What words could carry more truth than the burns on my hands or the scars on my arms? And yet, on the day of the ceremony, I found myself there. I stood in the far corner of the hall, pressed into the shadows, watching the crowd gather. Voices filled the space, rich and confident, the sound of people who had never walked the freezing basements where I spent my nights. My jacket was plain among their polished suits, my hands rough among their soft, unmarked palms. I felt again the weight of being invisible, of being out of place. Then I saw it. At the front of the hall, draped in heavy fabric, stood a plaque, hidden beneath a dark cloth. The outline of engraved letters bulged faintly against it. Waiting. I knew what it meant before anyone spoke a word. That cloth concealed something more than metal. It hid the truth they could no longer bury. I did not yet know what I would say, if my voice would hold steady, if words would come at all, but in that moment, as my eyes locked on the covered plaque, something inside me shifted. This was no longer about humiliation or pride. It was about truth finally stepping into the light, where even arrogance could not deny it. And for the first time, I felt ready. The speeches dragged on, polished words from polished mouths, each one congratulating the university for its resilience, for its commitment to progress, for its ability to turn challenge into triumph. I stood in the shadows, my hands folded, my heart steady, listening without hearing. Their words floated above me like dust in sunlight, empty, fragile, meant for applause. Then the moment came. The rector stepped forward, his voice carrying through the hall. He spoke of the night when the university was nearly lost, of the flood that threatened to destroy what generations had built. He spoke of how salvation had not come from chance, nor luck, but from foresight, dedication, and hands that had labored in silence. And then he gestured toward the covered plaque. The curtain fell, and there it was. Bronze letters gleaming beneath the lights, carved deeper than the laughter I had once endured. Hall of Water Systems, named in honor of my name. For a moment, the hall seemed to hold its breath. And then the sound rose, applause, steady and loud, filling the space like a tide. The rector stood first, his palms striking together with gravity. One by one the others followed, some reluctantly, some eagerly, until the hall thundered with recognition. I felt the air shift. Faces turned toward me. Those same faces that had once twisted in mockery, that had once smirked when I tried to speak, that had once spat the words, "You just fix pipes." Now their eyes faltered. Some tried to smile but could not hold it. Others kept clapping but could not meet my gaze. Their hands applauded, but their shame sat heavy on their shoulders. My son was there too, standing stiffly, his hands moving but his eyes fixed on the floor. Pride and regret warred across his face. And in that war, I saw the truth. He finally knew. He finally understood who I was, what I had given, what could never be erased. I did not smile. I did not bow. I simply stood, my back straight, letting the sound wash over me. Because this moment was not about triumph. It was about justice, the quiet kind that arrives not with revenge, but with truth too strong to remain hidden. The hall that once ignored me now carried my name, and no laughter could erase it. The applause faded, but the sound of it lingered in me like an echo carried through pipes long after the water has passed. I stood in the hall where my name now shone in bronze, and for the first time in my life I understood something I had always known but never allowed myself to claim. Betrayal can wound, humiliation can scar, but truth does not die. For years I had been invisible, the man with the wrench, the shadow in the basement, the one dismissed with a laugh and a phrase, "You just fix pipes." They had stripped me of dignity in meetings, silenced me with their arrogance, erased me from their stories of progress. Even my own son had turned his face away, ashamed of my work. Those moments had crushed me, pressed me into silence, forced me to swallow the fire of my own worth. But here, in the heart of the university, my name was carved in metal, gleaming beneath lights that no one could turn off. The truth had risen, unshakable, undeniable, and permanent. I ran my hand over the plaque, my fingers tracing each letter as if to confirm it was real. The cold bronze was heavy with meaning, carrying not just my name, but every night I had walked through freezing corridors, every hour I had spent in the boiler room, every burn on my hands, every scar on my skin. It was not a dedication to me alone. It was a testament to the invisible labor that holds the world together, the kind of work mocked as dirty, until the day it saves everything. I thought of the nights when the pipes groaned in protest, when the system was close to breaking and no one else heard. I thought of the moment the flood came, when I was alone in the freezing dark, waist-deep in water that wanted to swallow the university whole. I thought of my hands, gripping a wrench until the skin tore, pressing my makeshift valve against the roaring split, refusing to let go even as the cold bit into my bones. Those moments were no longer secrets buried in the basement. They lived now in the walls of this hall, in letters that would outlast all of us. Around me, the crowd still stood. Some clapped hesitantly, some with genuine force. But I no longer needed their hands or their voices. Respect had returned, not because they chose to give it, but because the truth had left them no other choice. The systems they called invisible had spoken with my name, and no one could silence them again. I saw my son at the edge of the room, his head still lowered, his hands at his sides. There was no laughter in him now, no smirk, no quickened step to escape me. Only the quiet understanding of a man who had finally seen the truth of his father, not in words, not in arguments, but in the permanence of a name etched into stone. That was an apology deeper than any he could speak. As the ceremony ended, and the hall began to empty, I remained behind for a while. The warmth of the lights fell over me, the hum of the building's systems murmuring like a chorus I had always known. And I understood then. My legacy was not the applause, not the speeches, not even the plaque itself. My legacy was in the warmth that filled the classrooms, the water that flowed without fail, the light that kept the darkness away. It was in the systems that breathed because of my hands, systems that would carry my name now as surely as they carried life through the veins of the university. Betrayal had tried to erase me. Laughter had tried to bury me. But betrayal cannot destroy truth, and laughter cannot silence dignity earned in sweat and sacrifice. Respect returns, always, sometimes slowly, sometimes late, but always. And when it returns, it carves itself deeper than cruelty ever could. I left the hall quietly, the winter air biting against my face. Behind me, the building stood tall, alive, breathing through the very pipes I had given my life to, and in its heart, my name was now a voice, steady, unshakable, eternal. A voice that would speak long after I was gone, reminding the world that the man who just fixed pipes had, in truth, kept it alive.